I mentioned the Negev just now. The Negev and the Galilee are two areas of the state that from 48 until now were the areas where, relatively speaking, the most number of Palestinian citizens live, basically. And because of that, the state has had a kind of anxiety about those two regions, because the State of Israel's concern is to do with demography, it's to do with viewing non-Jews as constituting some kind of existential threat, because of the whole project being the establishment of a state for one group of people in an area where there was already a majority of another group of people. So the Negev and the Galilee have been targets for what is referred to as Judaization policies, the idea being that you're trying to boost the Jewish population in those areas as a way of trying to increase their numbers in contrast to the Palestinian citizens of that area. Again, with a lot of these policies, reflect to yourself what the equivalent might be in Britain or something, or in France or whatever, or in the US. Think about how those policies would be viewed here. And then think about how Israel is portrayed by the Israeli government, by people who defend Israel, as being not just the only democracy in the Middle East, but even as like a paradigm or model democracy. I'll just give you one example of these Judaization strategies. Okay, in the 70s and the 80s, the state, in association, cooperation with groups like the Jewish Agency, established these communities called mitzpim, which in Hebrew means lookout communities, on the hilltops in the Galilee. And the goal being, in the words here of the one of the planners involved, to keep Arab villages from attaining territorial continuity. Okay, so the state is viewing its own citizens, who are not Jews, as constituting a kind of threat, and therefore you need to break up the areas where they live with Jewish communities on the hilltops. Another example of this is the housing minister talking in 2009. He referred to a national duty of preventing the spread of Palestinian citizens. And he was referring specifically to the Galilee area, where he talked about populations that should not mix, in his language, are spreading in the area. And this is Ehud Olmert, who obviously went on to become Prime Minister and op-ed writer, I guess more recently, speaking in 1998. Then he was the mayor of Jerusalem. He said it's a matter of concern when the non-Jewish population rises a lot faster than the Jewish population. Just to give you an example, this is the sort of concern that the state has towards its own citizens who are not Jewish. The obsession with demography. I mentioned that the apartheid analysis exists independent of South Africa, but it's a worthwhile point of comparison at this point to note that the same obsession with demography and numbers and combating dangerous number of the other, it's very similar to what happened in apartheid South Africa. Something specifically about the Negev too, because this is a very contemporary issue for the Palestinian citizens who live in these unrecognized communities. There's tens of thousands, 70, 80, 90,000 Bedouin living in these communities in the south of Israel, who are all citizens of Israel but live in communities that the state doesn't officially recognize as existing. So they're not on the map, and it's very difficult for them to be connected to basic infrastructure. They suffer from house demolitions, and in some cases, the only reason why they're in their particular location is because the Israeli army forcibly moved them there in the first place from their original location in the 50s, when during kind of from 48 all the way up through to 66, but particularly in the 50s, the Palestinian citizens of Israel were subject to martial law, and so the military had the ability to basically, one of the main impacts of that martial law was the ability of the Israeli military to forcibly move out non-Jewish citizens for confiscation of land purposes. As of today, there is a plan that is ongoing that is kind of it's difficult to exactly work out the timescale for how it will be fully implemented. But this Prower plan, which is the name of the guy who headed the committee that the Israeli government appointed to work out the plan, this plan, which is meant to be developing the Negev for all of its citizens, that's according to like the kind of official briefing, what it's actually doing is threatening up to 40,000, maybe more, it's unclear at this stage, Bedouin citizens with forced expulsion from their unrecognized villages. So in other words, the state, instead of recognizing these communities, instead of regularizing their condition, instead of building roads, instead of kind of building infrastructure for them, instead want to demolish completely a lot of them and forcibly move the inhabitants to these official shanty towns that are always at the lowest levels of all the socio-economic kind of indicators within Israel. And this is linking the sort of demographic anxiety to these ongoing contemporary policies of ethnic cleansing. This is Shimon Peres, and he was talking to US officials in 2005, it came out in a WikiLeaks cable. He was worrying that Israel had lost land in the Negev to the Bedouin and would need to take steps to relieve the demographic threat. Right, this is Shimon Peres, the current president, who is positioned in the Western mainstream mind, imagination, as being a moderate, right, as being a dove of some kind, and even like within the Israeli political spectrum, like that's where he's kind of generally positioned. But here you see him, and obviously he didn't think this was on the record, I mean in terms of it being in the public eye, but here he is using language and advocating positions that if you heard someone say that today in the streets of London, you would automatically associate them with the far right, right, in terms of a language of easing a demographic threat, of the wrong kind of people being a particular area, etc., etc. Here's another example. Again, remember, so far we're only talking about policies with regards to Palestinian citizens. Admission committees or kind of selection committees have been another tool that has been used to exclude Palestinians from land and communities and kind of maintain Jewish control of space and natural resources and that sort of thing. So they operate in about 70% of Israeli towns. The most, in terms of number, the vast majority of Israeli communities are very small. I mean, okay, most of the population lives in big cities, but there's hundreds of these small communities. And to live in them, you need to be accepted by this committee, who can deny residency on the grounds that you're not socially suitable to the community. And on that committee will often sit members of groups like the Jewish Agency or the World Zionist Organization, whose mandate and remit is to benefit and privilege Jewish people. This is Human Rights Watch talking specifically about admission committees in the 48 area. They've notoriously been used to exclude Arabs from living in rural Jewish communities. Now the role of these communities has since been, in the last couple of years or so, has now been legislated in about 40% of Israeli communities. Okay, so they've existed anyway, but now their role has been legislated for in about 40% of communities. When that law was being debated and then passed in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, a Kadima member of Knesset, again like a centrist party, said that the purpose is to preserve the ability to realize the Zionist dream in practice. Okay? So a law that can be used to exclude non-Jewish citizens from a particular community, in this member of Knesset's words, the point of that law is actually that you're realizing the Zionist dream in practice, i.e. Jewish settlement and the exclusion of Palestinians. And this is another member of Knesset from Lieberman's party. Jews and Palestinians should be separate but equal. If that sounds familiar to anyone. And, quote, Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, not a state of all its citizens. Okay, for which we thank David Roten for his honesty. And another example, there is also a law that has been in effect for about a decade now, which restricts the ability of Israeli citizens to live with their husband or wife if that husband or wife is a Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza Strip. Okay, it makes it almost impossible in most cases. Of course, that law only really impacts on the 20% of Israeli citizens who are Palestinian, because the number of Jewish citizens who want to marry Palestinians is very small. So, effectively, a Palestinian citizen's ability to choose their partner is now being influenced or shaped by Israeli Apartheid laws. When that law came up in front of Israel's High Court, opposed by some human rights groups in Israel, the judges of the High Court, their majority opinion was in favour of the family separation law for this reason, that, quote, human rights are not a prescription for national suicide. Again, remember, the High Court is seen, again, within Israel and also outside in the Western mainstream, liberal mainstream, the High Court is seen as a kind of protector of the worst extremes within Israeli society in terms of protecting minority rights, etc., etc. But you can see here that the High Court majority opinion invoked, again, very similar language to that of apartheid South Africa, talking about the law. The reason for the law isn't for security in the language of the High Court and of many of its defenders. The reason for the law is to prevent Palestinians getting citizenship through marriage within the context of combating the so-called demographic threat, i.e. again the constant obsession with racial demographics. This is what one member of Knesset said about the law when the High Court supported it. He talked about it being in the context of, quote, the rationale of separation between the peoples and the need to maintain a Jewish majority and the Jewish character of the state. And this is a quote from a text from an apartheid South African political party's platform from the days of apartheid. Either we must follow the course of equality, which must eventually mean national suicide for the white race, or we must take the course of separation. I also want to point out here that the language of separation being advocated by the Kadima member of Knesset there, on the third bullet point, the quotation and from the High Court, which echoes the language of apartheid South Africa, I want to point out that that language of separation is most often pushed not by the Israeli right, okay, remember it's all relative, pushed by the Israeli right like Netanyahu and people to the right of Netanyahu, yes that's possible. Actually that language of separation is most often pushed by so-called liberal Zionists who want to protect the ability for Israel to exist as a privileged Jewish state, as an ethno-religious Jewish state, in most of historic Palestine. And in order to do so, say that for that to take place, we have to have a separation, and in order for the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza